And we're very excited for this opening plenary of the Freedom Dreams, Freedom Now conference in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. So over the next few days, we will fuss and fight and debate and disagree, but hopefully at the end, we will have deepened our understandings, widened our circles, and reignited our commitment to justice. We come together in the spirit of brilliant thinkers and thoughtful organizers. In the spirit of Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, Edward Said and Paulo Freire. In honor of all the political prisoners from Delhi to DRC, and from Coleman, Florida to Frackville, Pennsylvania. We come together realizing that even as we have carved out this precious space with this amazing cohort of people to talk about the importance of freedom, that there is indeed the denial of freedom, the theft of freedom, the erosion of freedom all around us. We come together fully cognizant of the plight of Assata Shakur and Rasmea Odeh, two courageous activist women, one forced into exile, the other fighting not to be exiled, and in solidarity with the campaign that seeks justice for Marissa Alexander. And very special in our hearts as we talk about the youth-led movements of the 1960s, organizations like the amazing Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We have in the forefront of our minds the young people of Chicago and the young people beyond Chicago. We have 13 campuses represented and many youth organizers. Some caught up in the school to prison pipeline and many building pipelines to justice. I think it's important, and I'm a historian by training, I think many of you know that we have carved out this moment to look back as a way to look forward. In that vein, I want to invite us to take a moment of silence to remember three very heroic fighters for justice who have passed away very recently. And if circumstances had been different, I think all three of them would have been with us today. I'm referring here to Chokwe Lumumba, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, who was really pioneering a different path in Jackson, Mississippi, the place where so many young civil rights workers were shot at, arrested, beaten, harassed. Chokwe passed away earlier this year. General Baker, legendary labor organizer in Detroit, one of my heroes growing up as a young activist in Detroit, worked in the auto plants, was a member of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, an amazing, kind, and generous human being, passed away just last week. And finally, Dr. Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding, I was just reminded by my colleague Kate Fossil that Vincent had a saying that he would say that we are citizens of a country that doesn't exist. I always remember him saying too that people who say things haven't changed don't remember the way things used to be. Now he said that not to say that we should be satisfied with the way things are, but that we should understand the enormous potential for human beings to transform themselves and the world around them when they put their minds to it. Vincent had agreed to offer a Skyped greeting of welcome to those of us gathered here for this, and I had been on the phone with him back and forth. He was at a retreat in Pennsylvania, and as many of you know, he was an advisor to Dr. King, but also a mentor to Zahara Simmons, who is here with us today, and many others. His daughter Rachel, herself an activist and scholar, will be with us during one of the sessions coming up tomorrow. But I want to invite us just to have a moment of silence in remembrance of Chokwe Lumumba, General Baker, and Vincent Harding, and of course the sad news this morning that the poet Maya Angelou also passed away. And Mama Mabel Williams passed away, how long ago? About a month ago. That was a wife of Robert Williams, people are familiar with, and heroic, long-term struggler and activist. Thank you. So I ask us to take that moment of sobering reflection, not to make us sad and not to make us feel defeated, but to really make us recommit ourselves with the kind of resolve that many people who have come before us have exhibited. We come together at a critical moment in the struggle for peace and justice in the world. In the next 2 days, we will look back as a part of the process of mapping our way forward. 1964 was a historic moment of youthful idealism and sober realism. We will remember the pivotal chapter in the Black freedom movement in the US, but with the full understanding that was never an isolated, one-dimensional movement. That it is the struggle for Black freedom has always been intimately bound up with many intersecting struggles. At its best and broadest, it has been a movement that has simultaneously stood against war and empire, occupation and patriarchy, homophobia, nativism, and repression. So all the complex yearnings for freedom are on some level represented in the program of this gathering. In the lives, in the stories, in the scholarship, in the research, in the creative art and literature of over 200 presenters. For those of you who are with us at the end, and we hope you'll be energized by the conversation and the presentations that you'll experience in the next 2 hours, at 8:30 we will also offer for you the Chicago premiere of Stanley Nelson's newest documentary, Freedom Summer. It's a PBS documentary. Of course, Stanley Nelson is an award-winning filmmaker, and a number of our panelists have been interviewed and are featured in that film. And so we invite you to stay for a late evening of stimulating discussion, film, and exchange. So thank you very much. I'm now going to invite Avery to join us up here to start us off with a song.
Hey, hey. All right, since I'm going to end up down here anyway, I'm going to start down here. That cool? That's cool, all right? Alabama got me so upset. Tennessee done made me lose my rest. Everybody knows Mississippi, goddamn. Yeah! Alabama got me so upset. Tennessee done make me lose my rest. Everybody know Mississippi, goddamn. It's spelled M-I-S-S-I-P-P-I, M-I-S-S-I-P-P-I. Were you there when they did what they did to that boy? Were you there when they did what they did to that boy? Were you there when they snatched him out of Uncle's house? Were you there when they snatched him out of Uncle's house? Were you there when they brought him to the wife? Were you there when they brought him to the wife? Is this him? 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 Were you there when they led him to the barn? Were you there? They led him to the barn. Were you there? When they picked up a brick and plate, touchdown on the face. Were you there? When they picked up a brick and plate, touchdown on the face. Were you there? When they took the fan belt, tied around his neck and threw him in the river. Were you there? When they took the fan belt, tied around his neck and threw him in the river. Were you there? To see somebody wave and walk all night long. Were you there? The hill body wade in the water all night long. Were you there? Smelling body wade in the water all night long. Were you there? Feeling body wade in the water all night long. Hey, were you there? When his mama got the call, were you there? When his mama got the call, they got in, 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 they got in. When boys got in, they got in, they got in, they got in, they got in. Were you there? Were you there? See, got you. See him all dressed in black. Were you there? Were you there? See, got you all dressed in black. Were you there? Hear brothers cry, see sisters faint. Were you there? Hear brothers cry, see sisters faint. Were you there? Were you there? When the jury came back and said not guilty. Were you there? Were you there? When the jury came back and said not guilty. Now tell me, who gonna run for him? Who gonna raise innocent? Who gonna drive the multitudes? Who gonna stand for it? Who gonna fight for it? Who gonna sit for it? Who gonna?
Good evening. I'm Joe Horace. I'm director of the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement, and I have the distinct honor of introducing Mr. Bond this evening. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be a part of this conference. I want to first off thank all of the partners who made this possible. Barbara already did that, but I think everyone coming to the stage should take a turn. The mission of my institute is to transform democracy by creating more engaged citizens and effective leaders. So this conference celebrates a moment in history where one of the highest forms of civic engagement, direct action, was used to challenge laws, policies, and practices that were racist, inherently, and often brutally unjust. To me, this keynote is related to the Akan concept of Sankofa, the notion that one should not only look back for wisdom that's relevant today, but also apply that wisdom now, where it's appropriate, directly. And Barbara made reference to this, not necessarily calling it Sankofa. Our guest speaker was a pioneer in the civil rights movement and can help us put Sankofa into practice on this day when our country and the world learned that we lost a shining beacon of inspiration, Maya Angelou, whose words of wisdom will continue to inspire us through the ages. Mr. Bond's wisdom, stemming from his key role in the civil rights movement and a life dedicated to fighting for social justice, will no doubt inspire us here today as well. Mr. Bond's life has been one of continuous, tireless fight for civil rights and justice. In 1960, Bond, along with other student activists, were the founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Can you imagine the bravery of these students at this time in our country, the challenges that they were facing, to get together a small group of people and have the audacity to think they could do something about it. He organized through SNCC voter registration drives and led protests against segregation in multiple states across the South. He continued to fight even in roles after SNCC. In 1965, following the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he began a political career when he was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. But of course, you would think, well, we've arrived. There's been an election, right? And things have changed. But at that time, his fellow representatives refused to seat him, yielding only after a Supreme Court ruling ordered the Georgia House to seat him. So even after we had the right to vote, and we were electing people, we were still fighting battles to have our right for representation. Mr. Bond served as president of the Southern Poverty Law Center from 1971 to 1979. And he also served in the Georgia Senate between 1975 and 1986. He taught at several universities during the 80s and 90s, including American, Harvard, and the University of Virginia. And he served as the chair of the NAACP from 1998 to 2010. He continues to speak out on important issues today, including gay marriage and climate change. Mr. Bond is a graduate of Morehouse University, has been honored with dozens of honorary degrees and countless other awards and accolades in his lifetime. But for me, and to me, someone who was born after the Civil Rights Movement, I came to know Mr. Bond as that voice in the documentary Eyes on the Prize, that voice of authority, narrating, passing along stories, and other information about the Civil Rights Movement for my generation and folks younger than myself. And so last year, I got to do the same introduction to Diane Nash. And I did one thing. And I said, if I ever get to meet another one of these giants of the Civil Rights Movement, I'll do this again. And that is to say, you've received, Mr. Bond, tons of awards and accolades in your life, but how often do people from my generation just say thank you? And so I want everyone in the audience to stand up, and through our applause, show our support to this generation, our gratitude, our appreciation. Okay, thank you all. Or you can continue if you like. Our gratitude, our appreciation. We stand on your shoulders. And so, Mr. Bond, we look forward to more of your great storytelling that I enjoyed when I learned this great history of the Civil Rights Movement, great storytelling, teaching, and inspiration. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Julian Bond.
You know, I can't do this without her. If she was not here, I would not be here. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for this warm, warm welcome. It's a great, great pleasure to be here today. And over the days of this wonderful, wonderful gathering, it's so great to see so many of my old friends. These are not old people, these are old friends. People we've known for a long, long time, and to see they're still getting along, still doing what they did then. It's just great. I want to thank Dr. Barbara Ransby for pulling this together. If you've never put together something like this, you have no idea how difficult it is. If you've never done this, you have no idea how many telephone calls, how many letters, how many other things you have to do to make sure this comes together, to pull together this disparate group of people from around the country and have them come at the time and the place and do the things you want them to do. So let's give her a big, big round of applause. One thing I should tell you is I have a bad cold, and I hope I can overcome it during the course of this speech. But I want to begin with the state of Mississippi, the site of Freedom Summer, which always has had a special place in the American imagination. Mississippi-born author Richard Wright wrote a list of topics Southern blacks dared not raise in conversation with whites at mid-century. Blacks dared not talk about American white women, the Ku Klux Klan, France, how black soldiers fared in France, French women, the black boxer Jack Johnson, the entire northern part of the United States, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, General Sherman, Catholics, the Pope, Jews, the Republican Party, slavery, social equality, communism, socialism, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, or any topic calling for positive knowledge or manly self-assertion on the part of the Negro. And Bob Moses of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee said, when you're in Mississippi, the rest of the country doesn't seem real. And when you're in the rest of America, Mississippi doesn't feel real. And William Faulkner said, to understand the world, you have to understand a place like Mississippi. And as you've heard so lovingly and so excitingly, Nina Simone said, Mississippi, goddamn. In the fall of 1963, while what would become of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, while that was being debated in Washington, momentous events were occurring in the Magnolia State. At that point, few additional black people had been registered to vote in Mississippi, despite the best efforts of an organization called the Council of Federated Organization, or COFO, most of them from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Registration drives in Greenwood, Mississippi had produced very little. After some initial publicity, the press had moved elsewhere. The federal government had intervened when violence seemed imminent, but made no move to help get blacks registered to vote. In Mississippi, Bob Moses had begun discussing the idea of a freedom vote campaign. Mississippi's unregistered blacks would be asked to cast symbolic freedom votes in a mock election that would parallel the statewide election in Mississippi that fall. It was both an organizing tool as well as a chance to demonstrate that blacks in Mississippi did want to vote. Freelance social activist Allard Lowenstein suggested to Bob Moses that he be allowed to recruit white students for the Freedom Vote campaign. They would provide needed manpower, and their white skins might provoke interest from the news media that black skins could not produce. Lowenstein recruited 100 students from Yale, including yet-to-be United States Senator Joseph Lieberman, and from Stanford, to come to Mississippi between late October and November 4th, 1963, or Election Day. The mock elections candidates were Aaron Henry and Tougaloo chaplain Ed King. Henry was president of the Mississippi State Conference of NAACP branches, and he and King were running for governor and lieutenant governor, respectively. Their platform was radically different from usual Mississippi candidates. They called for school desegregation, fair employment, and a $1.25 minimum wage. Over 80,000 blacks cast freedom votes, while journalists flocked to interview the white students, and FBI agents appeared where none had ever appeared before. For most purposes, the presence of the white students from Yale and Stanford was a great success. They brought media and FBI attention to the movement that both had ignored before. But during a SNCC staff meeting in Greenville in mid-November, the idea of more white students coming to Mississippi for a longer time was considered. At a December COFO meeting, the idea was discussed again. There were suggestions that the number of whites be limited to 100. In late December, SNCC's executive committee approved the idea and sent SNCC staff to COFO's January 1964 meeting to lobby for the idea. The COFO staff gave its agreement. Bob Moses said, these students bring the rest of the country with them. They're from good schools and their parents are influential. Stokely Carmichael said, with all these people here in Mississippi, national attention will be here too. Later, James Forman wrote, we made a conscious attempt to recruit from Ivy League schools, to recruit a counter-power elite. John Dittmer, who's seated in the audience here, is as close to the movement as any other historian, wrote about the freedom vote. Most stories centered on the Yale and Stanford volunteers rather than the local people and veteran organizers. Even journalists sympathetic to the movement fell into the trap. When Ronnie Duggar of the Texas Observer, in a positive article on the freedom vote, his lead paragraph began, Bruce Payne is a white, blonde-haired 21-year-old graduate student in political science at Yale. The media's fixation on the white students remained constant until the end of the campaign. Lowenstein recalled that on election night celebration, the TV cameras were all there, and they focused again on the white students. And the bitterness of the SNCC workers was very understandable and intense. Without the presence of the white students, however, the media would have paid much less attention to Mississippi in the fall of 1963. Until the winter of 1963-64, the question of whites in the Mississippi movement had not been contentious. COFO staff considered the presence of whites too dangerous, both for them and for local blacks. Whites working in black communities brought in the wrong kind of visibility, and the sight of blacks and whites organizing together, particularly white women and black men, was a red flag for segregationists. The Freedom Vote campaign had demonstrated that whites could operate in the field as well as in the office. And SNCC historian Claiborne Carson writes, the racial and class backgrounds of those selected for Freedom Summer reflected COFO's strategy of seeking outside intervention in Mississippi. The fact that the volunteers were expected to forego summer jobs to pay for their own transportation and to provide their own bond money in the event of arrest ensured that affluent students predominated. There had been no efforts to, oh, my page is out of line. But we'll fix that. Oh. There was no effort to increase the number of blacks by providing financial aid. Movement supporter Lewis Allen was murdered in Macomb, Mississippi in January 1963. In the aftermath of his death, historian Taylor Branch wrote, "Bob Moses threw his influence behind the Summer Project. For him, shell-shock reality overrode lingering scruples about importing masses of white volunteers. It prevailed over staff resentments that whites would intimidate movement Negroes and over moral reservations about using young whites as sensational guinea pigs to force federal intervention. It also overrode in Moses a philosophic unwillingness to cut off debate by fiat or personal authority. We can't protect our own people," he gravely announced. From then on, the Summer Project merely became a question of details. For the Summer Project, COFO divided Mississippi along the lines of its congressional districts. CORE would work in the 44th District, SNCC had the others. From the very first, there were political differences SNCC had to overcome. Al Lowenstein had reportedly told Stanford students they could work in the summer under his direction. In Boston, recruiter Barney Frank, yes, that Barney Frank, was saying those he recruited would be under Lowenstein's direction too. Lowenstein further wanted the summer's work directed from New York. SNCC and COFO would not allow Lowenstein to dominate. At Bob Moses' insistence, SNCC moved its national headquarters from Atlanta to Greenwood for the summer. The fact that the volunteers would have to be self-supporting, limiting the number of blacks, also meant that volunteers would be slightly older than typical college students. Most recruitment was done by Friends of SNCC groups around the country, established by SNCC to provide funds and political support for the Southern movement. Other civil rights groups with campus chapters, especially CORE, did the recruiting too. To avoid control by Lowenstein or other outsiders, applications were sent directly to the COFO office in Jackson. Considering the absence of today's social media, the organizers did and recruiters did a wonderful, wonderful job. This brochure invited others to come. Applicants who came were hardly typical Americans. Average family income in the United States in 1960 was $5,600. The Freedom School summer applicants' family income was 50% higher, $8,400. Median income for a Mississippi black family was only $1,400. Thus, the poorest people in the United States would play host for the summer to the children of the most privileged. Living in the poorest state in the United States, most of Mississippi's black population worked in non-mechanized cotton farming. In 1960, 68% of all Mississippi blacks lived in rural areas. In the rest of the United States, only 38% of blacks were rural. The median non-white income of $1,400 was the lowest in the United States. 86% of all non-white families in Mississippi lived below the federal poverty level. In 1960, the 6th grade was the median education level of Mississippi blacks over 25. For whites, it was the 11th grade. 42% of whites had finished 12 years of school. Only 7% of blacks had gone that far. In 1964, Mississippi spent $21 per black child and $81 per white child. In Holly Bluff, Mississippi, education expenditures were $191 for each white child and $1.26 for every black child. Infant mortality rates for blacks were twice as high as for whites. 2/3 of all black housing was deteriorated or dilapidated. Half of all black housing had no piped water. 2/3 of all black housing had no flush toilets. In 1960, only 7% of voting-age Mississippi blacks had been registered to vote. 5 counties had black population majorities and not a single registered black voter. In Coahoma County, 95% of the eligible whites were registered to vote. Applications from summer volunteers came from 233 schools. Elite private universities, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, provided 40% of the 123 of the 736 who applied. 145 others came from elite public schools, Berkeley, Michigan, Wisconsin. Students from the highest ranking public and private schools provided more than half of the applicant pool. They included President Clinton's lawyer-to-be David Kendall and author Susan Brown Miller. They were the children of the powerful, if not the rich. Some volunteers listed as their references Eugene Rostow, Arthur Goldberg, Bill Moyers, William Sloan Coffin, Herbert Marcuse, and Representative Phil Burton, Democrat of California. Of the applicants, 10% were married, usually to another potential volunteer. 90% of the applicants were white. a figure reflecting both the need to be self-supporting and the fact that during the 1961-62 school year, blacks were only 2.9% of the college students in America. 49% of the applicants were female, a higher number than the percentage of women in college. In 1964, women were only 39% of the graduate students in the United States. Most of the students came from the Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic, and far west states. Almost half, 46%, came from Illinois, New York, and California. Only 11% were from the South, and most of these were black. Their average age was 23. 20% had completed their undergraduate education, and seniors and juniors outnumbered freshmen and sophomores by 2 to 1. 22% had full-time jobs. 70% of those were teachers. Before the project began, the volunteers described themselves as optimistic and idealistic, religiously motivated, patriotic, and as conventional leftists, generally socialists. 48% belonged to a civil rights group, 21% to a church or religious group, 14% to a socialist or leftist organization, 13% to an affiliate of the Democratic or Republican parties, 13% to an academic organization, and 10% to a teachers organization. Half belonged to a core chapter or a Friends of SNCC organization. Fully 90% had some kind of civil rights experience, and 25% of the volunteers knew another volunteer. All these under 21 had to have parental permission. Most were interviewed on campus by someone from a Friends of SNCC organization. 70 were rejected, most because they were underage or applied too late. 25% of the selected applicants were no-shows. When interviewed later, 25% of the no-shows said their parents had convinced them not to go. This is Andrew Goodman in the black T-shirt. In a few days, he'll be in his grave. That's next James Foreman to his right in a white shirt. In preparation for the summer, the city of Jackson, Mississippi increased its police force from 390 to 450. They added 2 horses, 6 dogs, 200 new shotguns, stockpiled tear gas, issued a gas mask to every policeman. They added 3 canvas-top troop carriers, 3 half-ton searchlight trucks, and 3 giant trailer trucks to haul demonstrators to 2 large detention compounds at the state fairgrounds. The city's pride was Thompson's tank, named after the mayor, a 13,000-pound armored battle wagon built to the city's specifications at $1 a pound. Through the National Council of Churches, SNCC and COFO arranged for 2 week-long sessions for the summer volunteers to be held at Oxford College for Women in Miami, Ohio on June 14th to 27th. Setting out from Oxford from Atlanta in a red Volkswagen, James Bond, that's my brother, that's really his name too. He and I stopped in a small town in North Georgia to get gas and directions. Another red Volkswagen was parked nearby. One of 2 white men standing near it said, "That nigger's got a car just like yours. Are you gonna let him get away with that? Let's get him." They chased us for several miles until we were able to pull away. One of the speakers at the Ohio training session was the Justice Department's John Doerr. He told the volunteers not to expect federal protection. Maintaining law and order, he said, is a state responsibility. The volunteers attracted a great deal of media attention. They were white, young, attractive, heading into potential danger, willing to spend the summer living in primitive circumstances, the exact stuff from which media interest is born. A writer described the Oxford campus and the students. The atmosphere on the campus was brick and ivy. Everyone matched it perfectly in their ages, haircuts, dresses, and choices of words. From the very first, there were clashes between the movement's veterans, most of them contemporaries of the volunteers and the volunteers themselves. 250 of them left Oxford for Mississippi on June 20th and 21st. On the 21st, Bob Moses spoke to the remaining volunteers. Yesterday, he said, 3 of our people left Meridian to investigate a church burning in Neshoba County. They haven't come back, and we haven't any word for them. The 3 were Mickey Schwerner, a core worker from New York, James Cheney, a volunteer from Meridian, and Andrew Goodman, a New York volunteer. They were already dead when Bob Moses made his announcement. This is the missing poster that flooded Mississippi. The bodies of the missing men were not discovered until August 4th, after the FBI paid an informant for information. The summer's originally 550 volunteers were supplemented over the summer by from 400 to 500 more, but there were never more than 600 volunteers in the state at one time. There were originally 32 COFO projects spread throughout the state. By summer's end, there were 44 projects. The safest area proved to be the Gulf Coast, a tourist area more progressive than the rest of the state where illegal gambling and drinking had long been tolerated. The most dangerous was the 3rd District in southwest Mississippi, where SNCC had begun its voter registration in Emmett County 4 years earlier. 2/3 of the summer's bombing attacks happened in the 3rd. The volunteers were divided among voter registration work carried on in 42 projects, freedom schools in 30 projects, and community centers in 23 projects. Workers from SNCC and COFO helped to found the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an alternative to the racist and all-white Democratic Party, in April 1964. That June, the MFDP fielded candidates for Mississippi's primaries running for the House and the Senate. COFO decided to make another Freedom Vote campaign the previous fall. Many of the summer volunteers spent their time preparing for Freedom Vote as well as in regular registration work. Volunteers helped to organize the steps required to establish the MFDP as a bona fide political party. On August 6, 1964, 68 delegates, including 4 whites, were elected to represent the party at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. Over 3,500 students attended the Freedom Schools. This is Staunton Lynn lecturing to Freedom School teachers at the Western College Auditorium. And here are Freedom Summer volunteers leaving for Oxford, Ohio. Here's Hardy Fry describing his departure. Here are the safety rules volunteers were supposed to obey. And here is Peter Werner from Flint, Michigan, a graduate student at the University of Michigan, talking on the phone shortly after being assaulted while walking in downtown Hattiesburg. And here's Rabbi Arthur Lellefeld after being beaten in Hattiesburg with a tire iron while trying to register voter. This is Freedom Summer volunteer Anthony Below from San Francisco, a student at Dartmouth College, writing a letter while sitting on top of a U.S. mailbox in front of True Light Baptist Church. One adjunct of the Freedom Summer was the Free Southern Theater, founded in 1963 at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. Here you see actor Denise Nicholas. She later appeared in TV in Room 222 and In the Heat of the Night. At the summer's end, 4 project workers had been killed, 4 people had been critically wounded, 80 workers had been beaten, there had been over 1,000 arrests, 35 shooting incidents, 37 churches bombed or burned, and 30 black businesses or homes bombed. The summer's climax was a challenge to the seating of the regular Democratic Party's delegation. Here's Ms. Hamer saying notably, "We didn't come for no 2 seats because all of us is tired." 80 of the volunteers decided to stay after the summer was over. The majority of those who chose to stay were white women. Freedom Summer demonstrated that no part of the United States was off limits to civil rights workers. The summer's activities helped to pass the '64 Civil Rights Act, signed into law on July 2, 1964. However, the successes Freedom Summer achieved resulted from its embrace of a paradox. It tried to fight bigotry by appealing to people more concerned about whites than blacks. Appealing to the nation's racism accepted white supremacy. By acknowledging its dependence on whites to popularize the civil rights struggle in the South, SNCC contradicted its rhetorical belief in the worth of all equals, equal worth of all races, and undermined its insistence that indigenous blacks were best prepared to lead the struggle for their deliverance from white dominance. Some volunteers, consciously or not, fed the expectation that white involvement was necessary for black achievement. Some volunteers expressed dismay that blacks were not more grateful for their presence and the sacrifices they made to spend the summer in Mississippi. Some volunteers suffered from what was called the Jesus Christ complex. Foreman described a local peopleitis or bourgeois sentimentalism in which volunteers over-idealized the people with whom they worked, a mirror of the condescension and patronizing relationship between superior and inferior the movement was intended to destroy. In mid-September 1964, a meeting was held in New York City to discuss COFO and the possibility of a future summer project. The NAACP's representative said his organization could not participate in the future because SNCC dominated COFO. Alan Ornstein wanted to establish, again, a New York-based group to run a future summer project. Several of those in attendance objected to the presence of the Lawyers Guild, an organization of leftist lawyers. Before the '64 summer project began, Jack Greenberg, who'd succeeded Thurgood Marshall as director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, told Bob Moses that if SNCC used guild lawyers, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund would not participate in Mississippi. SNCC had earlier committed itself to open association when challenged to distance itself from Ann and Carl Braden. Bob Moses said he couldn't be forced to choose. The decision to participate would be the NAACP's, and Greenberg eventually decided to take part. Turn the page. While no multi-sponsored second summer project did take place, in 1955, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference sponsored the Summer Community Organization and Political Education Scope with 180 student volunteers in 30 Georgia and Alabama counties. Like the '64 Freedom Summer in Mississippi, they registered very few voters. The New York meeting was an early signal to SNCC and COFO that liberals wanted to control the Mississippi movement. In January of 1965, Dorothy Zellmer, whom I see seated there, then head of Boston Friends of SNCC, reported that graduate student Barney Frank a Lowenstein protege and recruiter for the 64 Freedom Summer, told her that a series of meetings had been held to change the decision-making base of COFO so it won't be dominated by SNCC. Frank told Zellner that a new governing board would be controlled by people who would put resources into Mississippi in the future. The new groups disagreed with SNCC's view of society, Zellner reported. What they want is to change it, let the Negro into the existing society, not to change it. Liberals like Lowenstein were right to be worried about SNCC's politics and direction in the late 1964, and SNCC correct to be worried about about liberals. John Lewis's March on Washington speech had been censored after President from liberals in the White House. The liberal foundations that supported the voter education project gave SNCC less money than they gave other civil rights groups, although SNCC had more staff doing more work in more places. Liberals had threatened to cut off legal help from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund if SNCC accepted help from the Lawyers Guild. SNCC wanted to do more than challenge segregation in the Deep South. As the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, it intended to challenge the Democratic Party itself. As the Mississippi staff prepared for the Atlantic City change and slowed down from Freedom Summer, the SNCC voter registration project in Selma, Alabama, and central Alabama was heating up. But that is another story for another day. Much of this activity drew from the sit-in protests of 1960. Those protests were the first and last time in modern America that sizable number of college-age black and white youth engaged in massive and risky civil rights protests in the United States. There have been other times and in some other places where political activism arose among the young, but the 1960s particularly come to mind. Why then? And why not since? And why not now? Why don't college-age young people gather together now to ensure that the unregistered are registered and the large population of occasional voters are encouraged to cast their votes? We are told in every off-year election that the party out of power will lose votes. The president's party will lose legislative seats. His party will suffer defeats. Why does that have to be so? What would it take to get the people in this room and the people they know and people elsewhere to dedicate their free time and weekends to civic activity, to registering voters, to helping them become aggressive citizens, to ensure the good guys win and the bad guys lose? Do it for Mickey Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andy Goodman. Young people can show their elders the way because this is a job for everyone. Howard Zinn, whom I met when he was a professor at Atlanta Spelman College, wrote about the risk and rewards of participating in a movement for social change. He said, even if people lack the customary attributes of power, money, political authority, physical force, as did the black people of the Deep South, there is a power that can be created out of spent-up indignation, courage, and inspiration of a common cause. And if enough people put their minds and bodies to that cause, they can win. It is a phenomenon recorded again and again in the history of popular movements against injustice all over the world. Not to believe in the possibility of dramatic change is to forget that things have changed. Not enough, of course, but enough to show what's possible. We've been surprised before in history. We can be surprised again. Indeed, we can do the surprising. The reward for participating in a movement for social justice is not the prospect of future victory. It is the exhilaration of standing together with other people, taking risks together, enjoying small triumphs, and enduring disheartening setbacks together. Let us go forward in that struggle. Thank you.
We're poets from Team Inglewood, and the title of this piece is Hide Your Schools, Hide Your Homes, and Hide Your Children, because you reckon it all. Hammer in one hand,
Paintbrush in the other.
Juan Emanuel is single-handedly destroying our city. Mr. Wreck-It Rum, look at what Chicago is becoming. Bending the rules to fit in a lot of building a new Chicago. Building new streets when your own plans got some potholes. Tearing down dreams.
It's getting real windy in these streets.
Red X's mark the spot where his wrecking balls are next to drop.
We are not included in the blueprint of the new Chicago.
We're being pushed out.
Our buildings being transformed into condos.
And we know those ain't for us. Fumble shocking setting in from the whipping winds of the heartless sins of the mayor.
Norfolk Railroads is pushing us southern folk out.
Homes we place with tracks where heads used to lay.
If drywall could talk, it would speak the many prayers to keep
Our homes now vacant lots that hold lots of remnants.
of 60 years of backyard barbecue.
Baby showers.
And when electric sliding was the superpower of the summer.
50 no one's losing all of this. Torture is tormenting us as we choke on the ashes of our memories. Cough, cough. Let's hope we don't get sick.
Because he's closing all our clinics.
He needs to get treated.
And maybe then we can sew back on the other half of his middle finger.
He's been giving us. But it's almost as if he's the Emmanuel of elimination.
Exportation.
Extermination.
Eradication.
Step 1. Take away their school.
Step
Step
2,
two.
kick them out of their homes.
Lastly, destroy all and
Deny. But remember to always keep a straight face when you lie. Trying to pour cheap paint over our eyes by stealing money from under our mattresses.
If there's not enough, close their schools.
But he's building a new DePaul stadium.
And using RTIP funds to transform the South Loop into the promised land of redevelopment. And some Riverwalk. Of course, downtown.
The paint is starting to streak.
Building a new Chicago or extending a new lie.
How can a city so in-depth blueprint something so expensive?
Banneker Elementary.
Closed.
Woods Elementary.
Closed. Yale Elementary. Closed.
The paint is cracking. From every West Side basketball brotherhood
To Southside sisterhood bonds through pom-poms and every poetry team that has dreamed to be on this very stage. Goodbye. Bad foundation for our future generations.
Struggling with 40 students in one classroom, so they learn from the streets.
It's not enough money for our schools, but it's enough to build that new Chicago. But that new Chicago is not for us.
The paint is thinning, and so is our patience.
Irreparable damage has already been done.
Time to stop the destruction of our city.
And prevent further corruption of our already twisted politics of Chicago.
According to Rom,
25% of CPS students won't amount to anything.
25,
50.
75.
100% sure that we will be something. See, Rom, we're mathematicians.
And your lies are adding up.
And building this new Chicago is
Just
Another
one of them. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a full panel and a lot to think about and talk about. And I'm not going to give long introductions. The bios on our website give you a fuller sense of all of the accomplishments and the history of this group of panelists. I will give some brief introductions, and we are running a little late in our schedule, and Dee Alexander is going to join us at some point to offer some freedom songs, and that might actually punctuate our conversation if I continue after that, because she has another commitment later. But I'll start at the far end. Peter Orris, who is now a medical doctor and researcher here at University of Illinois and an activist still, but in 1964 was an undergraduate at Harvard who Dottie Zellner recruited to go to Mississippi as the second youngest volunteer. I think you were probably 5 at that point, right? Next to him is Maria Varela. Maria Varela is a photographer and an activist in New Mexico, has worked there for a number of years. 20 years ago, she actually received a MacArthur Fellowship for her activism and her engagement with communities around economic development issues. But that passion for justice began in Mississippi and then more prominently in Selma, where she headed a literacy project and worked as a movement photographer. And her photographs are up here and around the room, as well as Sarah Jane Ree, who is a local activist photographer who has images of Chicago struggles paralleling Maria's images of the struggles of 1960. Next to Maria is Fanny Rushing. Fanny Rushing is a Chicagoan, a scholar whose activism was as a freedom school teacher for 5 years. But also 2 other aspects of Fanny Rushing's activism are very important. One was as a Northern solidarity worker, that is in Chicago, building solidarity for the movement in the South, but also then later in her career as a transnational solidarity activist with Cuba and also with Africa Solidarity, which very much comes out of the experience of SNCC. Next to Fanny is Charlie Cobb. Charlie Cobb is a legendary figure in SNCC. When I was doing my research on Ella Baker, everyone kept saying, you've got to talk to Charlie Cobb, you've got to talk to Charlie Cobb. I finally did tie down Charlie Cobb and get an interview with him. But he was a Howard University student who got involved in activism, first in Annapolis, Maryland, and then migrated to Mississippi, where he worked for 5 years. Charlie's often described as one of the people who inspired the formation of freedom schools. He went on to become a journalist and an activist on global issues. Zahara Simmons is next to Charlie Cobb. Zahara Simmons is a scholar and activist, a religious studies scholar, a feminist, one of the first women program project directors in Laurel, Mississippi. She describes herself as someone who was a Spelman girl at the time. That was the reference, right? She was a good Spelman girl who was discouraged by her family from getting involved in activism, but she didn't listen. And she got curious, and then she got active and has been active ever since, and has an activist daughter that many of us know and love, who's a wonderful filmmaker. Next to her is Dottie Zellner, who worked in Mississippi and New Orleans and Massachusetts, and in Atlanta alongside Julian Bond in the communications office and working for the Student Voice. She later went on to work for the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and was one of the founders of the Ella Baker internship program. So join me in welcoming, and of course Julian Bond, who's already received his introduction and probably needs none. But join me in welcoming this wonderful So I'm going to ask a few general questions and invite people to be succinct in their answers so we all have a chance to, so everyone has a chance to speak. But I was reminded in seeing the images that Julian provided and reading those excerpts. I mean, that was actually my mother's Mississippi. My mother was born in Sunflower County, and of course, heard these stories. You didn't know that? No. Yes. Born the same year as Fannie Lou Hamer in Sunflower County, Mississippi. So I grew up hearing stories about Mississippi, but it was a dangerous place, and you all were amazingly young and brave. So I want to ask you, what your thoughts were, what your freedom dreams were when you made the choice to go south in the summer of, in some cases, 1964, in some cases earlier. Each of you don't have to answer each question, but I wanted to start with that open-ended question. Anybody can jump in. Use the mic, Charlie, please.
There are two things I want to say very quickly. Firstly, you have to understand the sit-ins as actions in which young people challenge other young people to do something. So when the sit-ins erupted in 1960, I was in the 12th grade, and I'm seeing them on television. And what I saw for the first time was young people taking on white supremacy and civil rights. Up until then, civil rights had been something that grown-ups did. And there's a larger point embedded in this comment, and that is that if you really want to understand what I think of as the freedom movement more than I think of as the civil rights movement, then what you have to understand is that as much as it is affected by protests and challenges against white supremacy, it was more meaningfully shaped by the challenges that black people made to other black people within the black community. And that's what drove me south, seeing that kind of challenging and recognizing that you had to take on white supremacy.
I was already from the South, born and raised in Memphis, Tennessee, and I had heard about Mississippi all of my life, so I knew how bad it was down there. And yet, once I got to Atlanta and just saw the movement swirling all around me, and of course, Spelman was located about, a few blocks from the SNCC headquarters at 8.5 Raymond Street, a hole in the wall. And they would come onto the campus, and it's following up on what you said, Charlie, challenging us to join the next demonstration. And of course, Spelman was threatening us and daring us, to get involved. But here were these people, they were my age. A number of them had dropped out of college to work, and they really made me feel bad. They were like, what are you doing for your freedom? And, they were really, I think of Willie Ricks in particular, and everybody who was in SNCC knows Willie Ricks. Boy, could he get on your last nerve. So, you know, and I guess he must have seen a weak spot in me because he really pushed on it. So that was, you know, the challenge there. But since I've, in my latter years, started teaching at a college, I realized the role that Staunton Lynn and Howard Zinn, and even though Vincent Harding was not teaching at that time, here were scholars who started teaching me history that I did not know. And so a big part of that was the history of our struggle as a people that I had no knowledge of. And so that also had a tremendous influence. And lastly, just by accident, joining the West Hunter Street Baptist Church under orders from my grandmother to join a church as soon as I got there, and not even knowing who Ralph Abernathy was. So I just sort of stumbled into this big church that's close to the campus, and it's Ralph Abernathy, who I later learned is very close to Dr. King. And so I'm getting it sort of in a religious message on Sundays, that this was the time. So these things were really impacting on me, and by the time in 1964, I started school in 62, so over those 2 years, you know, I was really being pushed. And so by the time I learned about the Mississippi Freedom Summer, I learned through Staunton Lynn, who was working on the Freedom School curriculum, and I began to, as a student in his class in that second year, work on that curriculum project for a grade, as a matter of fact. So I just decided I have to go, even though I'm terrified. As I learned more about what was being planned, it was like, you know, you got to do this. I mean, and just pray that you're going to survive it.
I remember the exact moment that I read about the sit-ins. I was in a coffee shop near 42nd Street in Manhattan, and I was reading the Times, and I think it was on page 16 or page 38 or some back page, smoking, because we all smoked like chimneys then. And I looked and I couldn't believe this. In my case, I'm a couple of more years older. I was actually, for SNCC, I was old. I was 26 in 1964, and that was old. I am, I would say, a World War II baby. And as a Jewish person, the war lived in our house. Okay? And I was 7 in 1945 when the war was over. I can't claim any great conversion in my mind. I came from a red diaper baby. I'm a red diaper baby. I came from a left-wing family. I knew I had a moral imperative that you do not stand idly by, okay? And I read this newspaper. I said, gotta go. Now, I was fortunate I wasn't married, I didn't have a partner, I didn't have children, I just graduated school. There's nothing holding me back. I had to go. And being in SNCC has affected my entire life from the day that I went south in 1960, 4 months after the sit-in movement, to today. I have followed what SNCC taught.
I want to invite some thoughts and comments, maybe from Fanny next and Peter, and then we're gonna pause our conversation and invite Dee Alexander to come in and rev us up with some songs, and then we're going to continue our conversation. That wasn't our plan, but we're going to shift to that plan as a way to prolong this conversation, but also to allow Dee to share with us, because she was on a tight schedule, but I think that will be energizing rather than a distraction. So we'll do that. But question I wanted to ask, and it's been hinted at, and not hinted at, it's been discussed in Julian's comments. Sometimes from a distance, we look back at historical moments with a kind of romantic view. Maria might also have comments on this. I can't see everybody's face. No, it's okay. I know you're there. Is the internal politics and the internal struggles that made the movement what it was, and in some ways made it stronger. But I think that's an important part of the story, the difficulties within movement circles that people, paid attention to, plotted through, plowed through. Does anybody want to say, particularly in Freedom Summer, I mean, Julian talked about it, there were conflicts around privilege, around racism in the movement, and I think that's a part of the story that's an important layer. I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that.
Well, I was one of the SNCC staff. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was really against the summer project. I spent the summer of '64 in Selma with my own summer project where I had recruited 4 Afro-American students, a couple from the South, a couple from the North, to come and work in Selma. The movement there needed some literacy work in order to get people to go down and fill out the 21-question test. And I just knew logistically what I was dealing with 4 students, and how was SNCC going to deal with like 1,000, even though only 600 maybe ever showed up? A. B, I really had the sense that this would overwhelm all the work that had been done to build grassroots leadership. And how people, you could just see young people changing under the sort of mentorship of both the older SNCC staff as well as Ms. Baker. And I just thought, this is a disaster. And honestly, it wasn't until I was writing my essay in Hands on the Freedom Plow that I had this epiphany about, I am ever practical and often clueless. It's like history doesn't wait for things. There couldn't be any more murders like were happening in Mississippi. There just couldn't be. Something had to break this open. It was going to be really messy. It was going to be like childbirth. It's going to be horrible, terrible, wonderful, and beautiful. And so, but it took me years to get to that point where I could say it had to happen.
Okay.
I have very little profound to say about the internal struggles, which were there and present, but they were present with the SNCC staff and, if you will, my elders. I was a volunteer, and I was there to do a job, and I was there to do a job that I agreed with tactically, strategically, and to be allowed to do it with these idols of mine, having been involved in picketing Woolworths around the sit-ins, having been involved in New York City in high school as a student activist and with the frustrations, etc., having worked in the national office for the March on Washington with SNCC staff for a whole summer, having been in North Carolina and burned out of a summer camp the year before. So again, you're bringing me back to being the kid, and I love it. And so, I mean, I was just absolutely enraptured with the leadership. I was absolutely committed to the necessity of black leadership for the movement, and I was there to do a job, and being allowed to participate was the most wonderful thing. And what I learned about organizing, about talking to people, is irreplaceable. Now, I must say, and I'll add another word on this, when I was asked as the years went on, I was part of something very briefly called the Route 40 movement or process or whatever they called it. CORE had on the way to Washington. Washington was a segregated city at the time in the 50s, and when we were on the prayer pilgrimage for freedom in 1955, there was nowhere to go after the march in Washington, D.C. We wound up at a White Castle because you could buy it at a counter. So this entire country was absolutely riven with this poison of racism into its capital, and you heard the manifestation of that with the president. That was a personal issue for me. I was born in 45. I was not there in 45, but I had a mother that said, you can think of yourself whatever you want to think of yourself, but when they collect you for the cattle cars, you're a Jew. And you remember that you're a Jew. And racism in this country is the same issue that Jews were killed in Germany for, and it is the same issue, and when they come for blacks, they'll come for you tomorrow. The fact that you can't live where you want to live, that you can't walk down the street with who you want to walk down the street with, that hurts you, and it hurts whites. So this, and all whites, this is not an issue for just liberation of African Americans. This was a gut issue for me and the whites, and my mother taught me that.
Can I make one very quick point about this in response to this? Because I think in the arguments that took place internally about the Summer Project, and sort of like Maria, I was opposed to the Summer Project for pretty much what she said. But there's an important distinction between being an organizer and being a leader that exists in this argument that might be relevant today. If you're an organizer, you have to work within the consensus that exists in the community that you're organizing. And if you look at the arguments over the Summer Project, it was the organizers who were arguing against the Summer Project. Every single local person that we were working with in these communities favored the Summer Project. Mrs. Hamer backed me up into a corner, said, Charlie, I'm glad you came down here. What's your problem with having other people come? What am I going to say to that? From the local person's point of view, from the point of view of the person you're working with or the people you're working with, in Mississippi in those days, people coming to Mississippi from the outside was a good thing. And the more people that came from the outside, the better it was. From the organizer's point of view, we worried about the kinds of things Maria was just talking about. That distinction is important because if you're going to organize today, you're still going to have to figure out how to work meaningfully within the consensus that exists in whatever community you're working in.
Fanny, you want to add to that?
Well, I don't want to hold up D. Alexander. That would really be a crime. So let me just say a couple of things. Listening and talking with Charlie, with Hollis, and other people in SNCC, listening to Maria, I'm wondering if there was anybody in SNCC who was actually for the Mississippi Summer Project. And you asked what kind of organization, what kinds of internal struggles. I think that is the strength of SNCC, that there was all this tremendous diversity, all this disagreement about tactics, and yet such a commitment to making change that people were able to subsume all of that in the interest of moving forward for liberation.
Well, thank you. When we want to bring Dee Alexander and her accomplice into the room, and one of the really important aspects of SNCC was art, culture, particularly music and song. I think many of the stories are when people were most afraid, they sang. When they wanted to reflect determination, they sang. So freedom songs were very much a part of what held the movement together, propelled the movement, etc.
The free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till the current ends, and dips his wings in the orange sun rays and dares to claim the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through the bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with fearful trill of the things unknown, but longed for still. And his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. The free bird thinks of another breeze and the trade winds soft through the sighing trees, and the fat worms waiting for a dawn-bright lawn, and he names the sky his own. But a caged bird stands on the grave of dreams. His shadow shouts on a nightmare scream. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown, but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. Maya Angelou. It never lies, no alibis. It proves itself
will know the day we all are free. Free to reach out and touch another soul who needs a hand. The time for reckoning is beckoning, it's calling. Ba-da-da-da, we'll raise our glasses proudly as we toast humanity. Our hearts and minds and souls will know the day we all are free. The day we all are free. We all are free.
Tamika Reed.
Free to reach out and touch another soul who needs a hand. The time for reckoning is beckoning, it's calling. Ba-da-da-da, we'll raise our glasses proudly as we toast humanity. It's all for one and one for all. The day we all are free. The day we all are free. We are free. We all are free. We all are free. Can you sing that with me? We all are free. We all are free. Let me hear you. We all are free. We all are free. We all are free. Ooh, you sound good. I think I'll take down the road with it. Thank you so very much. This is one of those songs that one of the artists that I grew up listening to, Nina Simone. This is one of those songs that she sang. And I remember the first time I heard it, it was so near and dear to me and to my heart. how it feels to be free.
Thank you. This one on. Thank you so much. You know, thank you so much, both of you, Dee and Tamika. Thank you so much. Makes you want to feel what it makes you want to feel. I'm starstruck. Makes you want to be free and fight for freedom. So, yeah, so that was wonderful. And, you know, before we broke to listen to Dee Alexander and Tamika Reed, we were talking about issues of leadership. Charlie Cobb mentioned this question of organizing versus mobilizing, organizing out of a certain tradition. Ella Baker has been mentioned a number of times as an exemplar of a certain kind of tradition. I remember reading about SNCC once, many years ago, and SNCC people would be asked by a reporter, who's your leader? What did y'all say? We all are. We all are. So does anyone want to speak to the question of leadership, different types of leadership, and how that played out in SNCC in terms of organizing?
Well, first,
Speak into
the actual response is an Ella Baker quote, which is that strong people don't need strong leaders. I think it's fair to say that all of us in SNCC can be considered and consider ourselves the political children of Ella Baker. I mean, the whole reason we were involved in grassroots community organizing has to do with the influence of Miss Baker and her experience that she brought to us. Remember, Miss Baker was organizing NAACP local branches in the South in the 1940s. She organized Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1955 and became its first executive director, although she was the temporary executive director because these preachers had a lot of trouble with women in leadership roles. But I'll leave that alone in this conversation. I mean, the basic point is one of the important things to understand about the movement in the 1960s, and I think it's not just SNCC, I think it's CORE as well, and other groups less well known, is that what we were working at was getting people to find and raise their own voices in ways in which they could not be ignored. I mean, that's you know, it's one thing if Charlie Cobb in Washington, D.C. says people in Mississippi are dissatisfied or want change. Doesn't mean anything. It's another thing when Mrs. Hamer says, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. It's qualitatively different. For us as people working in the South, in the deep South, in the rural South, this notion that drove our work was getting people to understand that they had the right and could raise their voices to make a demand for the kind of society they wanted in ways in which they could not be ignored, and that they could lead that.
I think an example, you know, in terms of Laurel, Mississippi, there was no infrastructure there. So there were 3 of us who were to work in Laurel, but because there had been nothing built there as there had been in Hattiesburg, Meridian, and other places, we had to sleep in Hattiesburg and then drive up to Laurel, and we just had some names. And where they lived. And I happened to have one of those names, and it was a woman whose name is Mrs. Eberta Spinks, someone that people don't know about. But when I knocked on her door, and I was, you know, pretty scared and timid and not having any idea who she was or what her response would be to me, and she, of course, didn't know me, and I was kind of stammering and saying, well, I'd like to talk to you about voting, and she was looking me up and down, and she finally said, are you one of those freedom riders? And I didn't know if that was good or bad, but I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, come on in here, girl. I've been waiting on you all my life. And she was in her 50s. So that moment began the Laurel Project, because she said, what do you need? And I said, well, first of all, we need somewhere to stay. She said, you can stay here. I mean, it was just immediate. And I said, well, there are two guys with me. They're on the other side of the street somewhere knocking on doors. She said, my neighbor will take them in. And I said, well, we left our stuff in Hattiesburg. She said, go get it. And I mean, it was an incredible thing. But so not only, I mean, in some cases, people were just waiting. I mean, they had heard we were coming, and they were waiting. And I think that was one of the very interesting things about being in SNCC, working in a town where, you know, these people were ready, they were willing to put their lives on the line, because, you know, we could hop on a Greyhound bus and get out of there, but they were there and they were putting everything on the line, their homes, their jobs, etc. And so they wanted what we had to bring, but they already, that was my experience with the people in Laurel, they knew what they wanted, and they knew what they did not like that was happening to them. And so while they wanted any information, resources, what we could bring, but on the other hand, I would often laugh and say, you know, I have to do what Miss Spinks says, or she'll run me out of here. So, you know, it was a really very interesting sort of dynamic that existed between those of us and the people, and the fact that you can walk in a place that had no infrastructure, and in the space of 3 months have 2 freedom schools, a Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party chapter, and people trying to register to vote and participating in all aspects of what we were down there to do. So it certainly let me know that the people can bring about change, and they, once there is the motivation and the vision, which they already have, they just needed us to help them pull it off. That changed my life, because, you know, I was brought up like everybody else thinking that leadership came from the top down. But I learned differently, and it has influenced my life forever.
Well, I just wanted to add something. I've done a lot of talking to young people, and people want to know how this civil rights movement can be replicated, and they always ask, and we never know how to answer that. It probably can't be replicated in the way that it took, in the form that it took. But what the civil rights movement did, and following along what Zohara says, it showed the immense latent power that people in Mississippi had, and actually the power that we all have. And we don't even know it. And they have the drones, and they have the press, and they have, I'm afraid, the president, and they have all sorts of other things, but we have us. Now, us has not been able to get together, okay? And us is badly organized. I've always felt, though, that we, in the end, were smarter. And you can see from world events that there is only one thing that the oligarchs and the corporations are afraid of, and that's us. And that's the only thing we have.
I wanted to pull Julian Bond back into the conversation, particularly around the question of what we are fighting for, or what SNCC was fighting for, you know, perhaps what a social justice vision encompasses today, because the demands are often seen as narrow or small, but they were very large and had, you know, vast implications. And I think your career in Georgia, where you were elected to the state legislature but not allowed to take your seat because of SNCC's anti-war stance, you know, makes the link between SNCC and not only economic justice, which I think maybe Fanny might say something about in a minute, but to the war, to the anti-war movement and SNCC's anti-war and anti-imperialist politics. So you want to say something about that?
Well, first, let me tell you something that Bayard Rustin said about Dr. King. Everybody, I think in this room, will give Dr. King credit for being a remarkable leader in the way we think of that term ordinarily. A masterful orator, somebody who could just take this crowd and make them do anything he wanted them to. But Bayard said, and I wrote this down, Martin King couldn't lead organize to go to a bloodbath, meaning that he didn't have the thought of what people needed in the sense that the people themselves understood. And let me not go down this road any further. What was the question?
SNCC's anti-war stance.
Oh, the SNCC anti-war stance came because Sammy Young, who was a Tuskegee student and been in the Navy, was coming home from a demonstration in Tuskegee, and he had lost his kidney in service to, he was in the Navy, in service to his country. And so he had to go to the bathroom more than most people do, most men do. And he wanted to go to the bathroom, and he tried to go in this white-only gas station, and the guy shot him in the back and killed him. And the irony of this guy who's lost his kidney in the service to his country, not being able to go to the bathroom, was just too much for us. And the latent anti-war sentiment within the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee just, rose up like this. And we issued this anti-war statement, which if I told it to you today, would say, well, that's what people say every day about everything. But then it sounded radical and extreme, and it just caused tremendous upset in Georgia. I had been elected to the legislature, to a one-year term in the legislature because of the reapportionment of the state Senate and House. And the legislators just could not tolerate this. I think not only was I black, and part of the first group of black people elected to the House of Representatives in Georgia, there's already 2 black senators, but no black in the House. But I belonged to this radical organization, the Student on what is that? Student on what? What is it? What does that stand for? Anyway, and they voted to put me out, declared my seat vacant, called for a new election. I ran for the election. I won the election, and they threw me out again. And by that time, I'd gotten together with some lawyers, and I went to the Supreme Court, and eventually won and got in. But it was the anti-war statement, I think, the combination of a black person having an opinion about the war in Vietnam was just too much for my colleagues to be in the Georgia legislature. Serious, these are people who just could not countenance that. And years after it, I stayed in the legislature for 20 years when I finally got in. And one of my colleagues who had been in the House with me said to me, he said, Bon, what was that you did that made us vote you out? I wanted to say, you fool, you voted against me. You voted to throw me out. But, you know, you don't want to say that to people. Anyway, SNCC was so far ahead of almost everybody else in everything that we did, everything that we thought. You know, we've never talked about a great deal about what Jack Menace did for us.
Yes.
This is a name unknown to all of you, is it not? Jack Menace. Jack Menace was, I guess, I don't know what his title, if he had a title.
SNCC was the only civil rights organization that actually had a research department.
Yes.
And Jack Menace,
a research director
from New Orleans, smoked too much and drank too much.
Yes, he did.
And brilliant.
He pulled together the series of documents called the economic position of the Mississippi Negro, the economic position of the Alabama Negro, the economic position of the Georgia Negro. And you would read these things and say, wow, the position of the Negro in these states is worse than I thought. You know, we knew it was bad, but it was really bad. Jack could spell it out for you, and so on. And he traced, in Mississippi, I remember, he published this document that traced the ownership of some of these plantations to the Queen of England. The Queen of England owned interest in some of these plantations, and this woman is just sitting on our money, on our land, The Queen of England, imagine that. But Jack told a story, and we were so well informed about economics and other things, I think far above all the other organizations. You know, I don't want to talk about the NAACP. I was chairman of the NAACP for 11 years. Wonderful organization. Hope you all join. Really. Because, you know, it's the only soldier standing right now. And we need to support it and build it up. But compared to all of the other organizations, Congress of Racial Equality, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the NAACP, we were miles ahead of them. And it's a shame that we're not there now.
But there's others who are carrying on in that tradition, and some of them are in the audience, and we'll be hearing from them over the next couple of days. But this question about class politics and economic justice, I think, is really important in terms of SNCC's radical core. I mean, partly, and John Dittmer wrote about this very eloquently in Local People, that SNCC kind of flipped the script on class privilege in a sense. You know, that here are these college students with a certain amount of privilege, not because you came from rich families, but because you were college students when most people were not, and certainly most black people were not, going down and sitting at the feet of a Fannie Lou Hamer or an Annie Devine, and really aligning with very poor, rural, and working class people, and learning from them and seeing them as, you know, leaders and role models. I mean, that's one kind of class, analysis of the work of SNCC. But the other is how you saw economics and economic justice as being a part of what you were fighting for. And Fannie, I'm going to come down there towards you and Maria and Peter with that question. I know later you were part of the Mass Party Organizing Committee with Ms. Baker, and that was a group that took up the question of economic justice. Can you say something about this question?
I think one of the reasons that SNCC is so important is because it was a school, it was a laboratory, it was a family, it was a community, and the most important thing that it did was to teach us to establish relationships. And once you begin to establish relationships is when you really begin to make change. Martin Luther King is great, but Martin Luther King is greater once he comes to recognize the relationship of economic injustice to black injustice. Malcolm is great, but Malcolm is even greater at the moment that he starts to recognize the relationship of racial and class oppression and to recognize it outside the United States, around the world. And I think one of the things I say that I learned the most important lessons of my life in SNCC, and certainly one of them was beginning to trace the relationship of economic oppression to racial oppression in the United States. After all, we were living in Chicago where we had political representation. We had people who looked like us sitting in the city council. We had 6 of them. They were called the Silent Six because the only thing they ever did was to shake hands with Mayor Daley and to continue the oppression of black people. So very, very early on, you had to recognize that if in Chicago there was a relationship between economic and racial oppression, this was probably true throughout the United States. And Barbara told us to be succinct and quick. And so I'm trying not to be an academic and ramble. But I do want to say this, that the purpose of Friends of SNCC organizations everywhere was to do support work for the movement in the South. But in Chicago, where the school system was so horrendous that the superintendent of schools had decided that black children only needed to go to school a half day and in trailers, and the fact that this was linked to such extreme housing segregation in the city, there was no way possible for us to continue to just raise money for the South without being involved in local issues, which is what involved us with the whole question of the schools in Chicago. And so ultimately the national office began to say, well, one of the reasons those people up there in Chicago can't raise any more money is because they're spending too much time raising hell in the streets. And so it forced a conversation in SNCC about the role of Northern offices. It forced a conversation about the relationship of the North to the South. And the more involved we became in this, the more we came to understand what those connections were. And so I think this is one of the reasons. I mean, I want to thank Barbara for giving us this space today for all of us to reunite, because it's always wonderful to be with SNCC people. But it's really also very important to remember what kind of very distinctive contribution that SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party made to social change in this country.
I have another question.
Maria.
Well, this may, and I was going to start down there and work. And for those of you who are wondering about time, we are going to show the Freedom Summer film tonight. So we'll have some coffee maybe out there for you. But we'll go on maybe 10 more minutes in this conversation, and then we'll shift to the film. And so I wanted to give each person a chance to make a final comment, and the question or prompt, which you're free to ignore if you want, is I think it is important, particularly for younger activists, to know the trajectory of your career. I think most people here would probably say SNCC was a defining moment in your life, but you've lived many years since then and done many important things in terms of activism, in terms of fighting for justice in the world. And I think putting that out there is actually important for people understanding, the legacy of SNCC and how it's shaped. But then, I would say if you would like to say something to young activists today in terms of lessons from SNCC, or if you would like to ask them questions that they can then answer in the next couple of days when they're up here speaking. So you have a menu of options, my gal.
I stole too much time from the first, so I'll make this brief. And every time we get together on something like this, there's a great desire to sum up 50 years in 3.5 minutes. And so answering that question, I am no better able to do in this 3 minutes than when asked it in a short news story. So I'm going to ignore it, as you said. And because there are...
Not a whole 3 minutes.
That's right. There are 2 points I want to make, not relevant to the question, but I think relevant to our discussion here. The first thing that I discovered, not first thing, but one of the things I discovered in Mississippi and from studies later and for interaction with people later was the 60s, quote unquote, didn't begin with the beginning of the 60s and end at the end of the 60s. And more important than anything else, it was built upon a progressive movement that in this country extended from the Revolution on through the Civil War and on through the 60s. And while the progressive movement in the South and the anti-racist and black liberation movement in the South had been driven underground, as it had been driven underground in the North as well, the people were still there. And many of the people that we came in contact with who were ready to say, come into my house, I've been waiting for you, let's hook together, how are we going to do this, are people that had been active for many years. And this was part of an extension of that struggle and the tactics for the time that moved it. And then the other bookend, if you will. When we get together, we often talk about why don't we see the same kinds of mass movements today? And I would like to argue with you that we see the same kinds of mass movements today on quite a broad level, in new forms, in new ways, with new expressions that we probably wouldn't agree entirely with. We didn't agree entirely with anybody in the 60s either. And such as the first Obama campaign, huge mass movement of young people around the country, such as trade union activists that I meet with and see on a regular basis who every day are fighting the depression of workers about getting together and what does it mean and what can they do when only 7% of the workforce are organized. Thousands of young people around the country, thousands of young people struggling against racism on the questions of immigration, etc. Just extraordinary, with a radical vision. The people I work in the environmental movement, while the demands are general, save the planet, and important, if you will, also have a radical critique and a global critique today. So much of what Julian was describing as extraordinary, which it was absolutely and far in advance of others at the time, today is accepted across movements. So I think it's very exciting. I think we see it today. I think the opposition is even more sophisticated than we ever dreamed in isolating and minimizing, than we've seen. So that was stolen more time.
Time for gin and tonics. You ready? All right, I speak. Thank you. I speak a lot on college campuses today, and I also teach, and inevitably end up gravitating towards the activists, or they gravitate towards me, and they're burnt out. They're like discouraged. It's like it's always the same ones of us here on campus doing the same thing. What can we do? Why can't we be like you guys in the 60s? And I say to them, look, organizing is about building relationships. It's about asking that person that you think maybe wouldn't want to be part of the movement. You want to listen to them. Miss Baker listened more than she ever spoke. And she wasn't listening as opposed to get us to speak and get us, our articulation going, because she really learned from us, as we learned from the local people that we worked with. As you as students need to learn from fellow students. And don't be so quick to dismiss, often, many of them, for just being for themselves, because you don't really know. And until what got most of us here in the movement is we got invited in by people who wanted us to be a part of it. That invitation will be as important as it was then, as it is today, and as it will be 100 years from now. So that's the kind of work that needs to be done.
Well, the part of the movement experience that I find relevant today has to do with community organizing and earning the right to organize. In these murderous communities, and dangerous communities, while people didn't have a high level of reading, writing literacy, they were expert, quite literate in judging people and what people told them. And you kind of had to, by talking to them, living with them, playing with them, you were kind of earning your right to organize. People are not going to jump right away and doing something that you want them to do. There are always a few who will. And I think that's relevant today. One of the criticisms I had of Occupy Wall Street, and I had discussion. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and there was an Occupy Wall Street, and they occupied the park downtown. And I would talk to them from time to time. I say, well, how come none of y'all ever knock on my door? I live in the inner city. And I said, you really want to get a movement going, you have to figure out how to talk to people and how to earn the trust and respect and commitment of people. And you have to just interact, and that's that's really SNCC's story. That's what all of us were doing in these communities, is kind of embedding ourselves, earning in a very dangerous situation the right to be there and gain their support. That's a part of the movement I wish more thought was given to, particularly more thought in terms of what's applicable today, because obviously 21st century America is not exactly the same as mid-20th century Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama.
Well, I certainly agree with all that has been said, and I know that I spend a fair amount of my time wondering and pondering how do we move forward today around the issues that are confronting us, many of them seemingly based in economics. But before saying anything else about that, I live in Florida, and a number of the young people who made up and make up the Dream Defenders, that blew me away because, you know, I was there thinking, gosh, is it any way we can sort of get these college students activated? And, you know, Trayvon Martin was killed, and just, it seemed to me overnight, they were organizing, and every now and then they touch base, and, you know, because they knew about my SNCC background, to say, we need you to come to a meeting and talk to us about this, that, or the other. And so I saw this movement take off right there in Florida, and, you know, just blew me away to see it. I now am watching the Moral Monday movement, which has, of course, moved to South Carolina and to Georgia, and we've even done some fledgling stuff there in Florida. So I don't, you know, I know what we were able to do in the 60s, and certainly relationships, working with people at the grassroots, helping the latent leadership emerge, who then ran with it. I'm clear that we have to use the same kinds of things, even though I don't know how you ignite it in the way that it was ignited in the 60s.
Very briefly, when Zohara talks about Mrs. Spinks, who is waiting, I guess later on during this conference, Robin Kelly will be here, who's written really one of the best books I ever read in my life about the organizing in Alabama. And you talk about heroic organizing of the Communist Party in Alabama in the 30s. Hello, 30s. Try to talk to him while he's here. What I'm doing now is what SNCC told me to do. And SNCC said, the white people, to the white people, you have to go into your own communities, okay? People did try in those days and lasted, you know, 5 minutes or 10 minutes before they were driven out. So 45 years later, I am a Jewish activist against the Israeli occupation. And I know that young people are so precious to us, but I want to make a few comments to the older people. This is the time. If you haven't done anything lately, do it, because you don't have to worry about your resume anymore.
Barbara, one last word. I don't really think we have to say anything to the young people. I think we ought to bring Team Inglewood back up here again, because they have already articulated at least a campaign for Chicago. They have identified what is happening with the schools, with what the mayor's plan is for the city, and the fact that we're left out of it. They're already on the move. I want to hear some more about what they're going to do.
Kickoff plenary as the beginning of a conversation. I think it's a wonderful beginning grounded in the history of SNCC's amazing work. But I'm looking out at the audience and I'm thinking about the Bog Center in Detroit and Freedom Summer and the Detroit Summer and all the young people that come together for that. The Dream Defenders you mentioned, Black Youth Project 100, the Immigrant Youth Justice League, the Students Against Mass Incarceration, the Divest Movement, the Students for Justice in Palestine here in Chicago, Fly, Fearless Leadership by Youth. So there are a lot of young people doing amazing things in the tradition of SNCC, not replicating SNCC, not trying to be SNCC, but carrying on in the kind of tradition that SNCC borrowed from and learned from Ella Baker and others who came before. So I think there's a lot of challenges, but there's a lot of reason for hope and optimism. And what we want to do in these next couple of days is not just talk about what we're against, not just celebrate and relish in what we're doing, but to really think and talk seriously and deeply about our freedom dreams, and more importantly, how we can strategize to realize them. Thank you so much.